One of the things that the sort of MAGA coalition and the Trump administration may have underestimated, they would say they don't care, and they might be quite right not to care, is just how toxic Trump is in popularity terms in Europe. I mean, across Europe. Whether you're talking about France and Germany, where the National Rally and the AfD are growing, or in Britain, where Reform is growing in power, Trump is absolutely toxic and divisive as a figure.
One of the successes that Putin must be thinking he's having at the moment is you're creating this greater separation between the United States and Europe, the United States and NATO, and different elements of the EU. And it's been quite clear in some of the statements that have come out from Russia, they've been working very hard to try and put fracture lines between the UK and the EU as well. Whenever they turn around and blame the UK role, or the British Royal Navy, for the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline sabotage, that was quite clear that they were trying to tell the EU that your energy price has gone up because the UK did something, and everything else. Do you think Putin's getting some success in doing exactly that?
I think he's kind of firing at a sort of standing target, which is already there in a sense. There are already fault lines between the UK and the EU since Brexit, formally in 2020, between America and the rest of NATO, particularly the European members of NATO, but also between the US and Canada, but within the EU, between those who are more firm against the Russian threat, like Germany and France, and those who are like Hungary and Slovakia, much more relaxed about a warmer relationship with Europe. And then you've got the states on the very front line, Poland and the Baltics, who know what the danger from Russia is, because they've seen it before, they've seen it again and again, they've been invaded and brutalized over centuries by Russia. So they know what the Russian playbook is. So I think there are these pre-existing fractures, but yes, certainly I think Putin's been able to insert, the sort of wedges into those cracks. I don't think the West, in its broader sense, has particularly helped. But I think also we're unfortunately doing this at a point where various relationships in the West are going through transition. The UK still, we're only 5 years out from formalising Brexit. We still haven't quite established what it is that our relationship with the EU is. And of course, the new government has come in trying to sort of run back to the party and say we didn't mean it, have us back in a sense, or at least have us back on our own terms, at least into the wider family. It signed all of these bilateral agreements with various European countries, which have looked good at the press conference, but I'm sceptical about what they actually offer in concrete terms. And you do have and it's not just in terms of defence, you've got a broadening gap between a highly populist, nationalist, exclusionary, if not outright isolationist regime in America, which simply cannot abide its opponents under any circumstances. And you've got elements of that brewing in Europe as well, but you've also got a European establishment which looks on this kind of thing with horror. And I think one of the things that the sort of MAGA coalition and the Trump administration may have underestimated, they would say they don't care, and they might be quite right not to care, is just how toxic Trump is in popularity terms in Europe. I mean, across Europe. Whether you're talking about France and Germany, where the National Rally and the AfD are growing, or in Britain, where Reform is growing in power, Trump is absolutely toxic and divisive as a figure. So you've got all of these separations and shifting tectonic plates anyway, and along comes the invasion of Ukraine. And it's made it very difficult for us to manage that as well as all of these things. There is a kind of, can we just have one crisis at a time? But politics isn't like that.
Well, yes. And one of the things with the crisis that's going on at the minute, do you think that we're suffering from the fact that our politicians, because of our electoral system, because of our democratic approach, are tied to trying to get things done in a relatively short period of time, whereas Vladimir Putin can think in generational terms, and those that are supporting him with the CRINC countries, with China, Iran and North Korea, can think multi-generational terms as well. How difficult it is, and you've been at the Centre Parliament where a lot of these decision-making bodies lie, and you've been coordinating one of them. How difficult is it for us to be able to get our head around people who are thinking in those long-term time frames, and us to do something that could actually influence what's going to happen?
I think for a country like the UK, there are two separate problems, two separate challenges. The first is that because you're running on an electoral cycle, which is 4 or 5 years at a time, firstly, politicians always, and one understands this, prioritize things that will have an effect next week, next month, next year. They want to see the outcome before the next election. And that is obviously one thing that militates against long-term planning. The separate challenge, and it's almost the other side of this, is that they're willing to, so long as they don't have to make any actual firm commitment, they're willing to say almost anything about what will happen in 10 or 15 years' time, because the chance of them having to be held accountable for it are virtually nil. So, Sir Keir Starmer can talk about what the UK's defence spending is going to be in 2035. By 2035, he'll be in his early 70s, and he may, well, God knows, he may be 9 years into retirement by that stage. We don't know. It's not looking great at the moment. But, he certainly won't be Prime Minister and in a place where he or anyone that is close to him is held to account for failure or lauded for success. So he can afford to say, yes, of course, we'll have 5%. But actually putting in place the stepping stones to getting there, there's really no incentive for him to do. And I think there's also a much wider problem with the way this government has viewed the increase in defence expenditure, that it's sort of promising. But you do have those two weird things of, no, I want it now. And yeah, we can talk about stuff that isn't my problem, but I won't actually do anything to achieve it, but I'll say the right things. And those are, problems that we have to grapple with, because, we have a democracy, and every 4 or 5 years, everything can be changed. And that's one of the great things about democracy, but it's also one of the disadvantages.
Well, and then in a democracy, we've got different agencies and organizations that are apolitical. But we've had two major speeches this week, and both on the same day. One from new Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Rich Knighton, and the other from the new head of MI6, Blaise Metrawelli. And both of them put the Russian threat into a degree of context and the threat against the United Kingdom. What did you make of them?
I thought they were very interesting for their fairly uncompromising terms. It's very difficult for serving officials to be out and out critical of government. I mean, we saw what happened to Patrick Sanders when he was Chief of the General Staff, and he started talking about, whether we were ready for a full-scale conflict, whether we were ready for what are we calling it now, a whole society effort. By the end of that year, he was out of a job and off presenting podcasts. Can you imagine?
Tell me about it.
I thought they were firm, and they said a lot of useful things. But I think the real worry is that ministers seem to be looking at these speeches and agreeing with them as if they already agreed, as if they're singing from the same hymn sheet. And what people like C and what the CDS are saying is that, no, look, you're not doing enough. We are not nearly doing enough. This is what the Defence Committee said earlier this year when it reported on the Strategic Defence Review. There's been a lot of talk about a conversation with society about expanding our whole concept of resilience. Let's go broader than defence. Resilience, how we survive and protect ourselves as a nation. But the government says it wants this, but doesn't seem to be doing anything to bring it about. And if you're the government and you talk about a conversation, you're the only people realistically who can lead that. You can't leave it to, serving army officials, serving intelligence officials, or to civil servants. You've got to be out there front and centre saying, right, here's a starting point. Here's what I think. What do you think? And you need to engender that kind of conversation. And the government just isn't doing it at the moment. We're waiting for after paper, but nothing's happening.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I know Sir Rich Knighton and the UK CDS, and he's a very political animal. He understands Whitehall and the machinations of it. And every word that he said, he will have had cleared, and therefore would have been cleared through John Healey, the Secretary of State for Defence. So do you think this could have been Healey turning around in frustration and using Sir Rich to fire a warning shot across the bow of the Chancellor, because there was very little said about defence in the recent budget?
I think one would like to think that is possible. I think there is a problem here that, Sir Keir Starmer talks a lot about resilience and defence and our commitments to various places. John Healey, I think, has had a decent-ish record as Defence Secretary so far, although he has occasionally fallen prone to the "I say it and therefore it has already happened" syndrome. But I get very little sense from the Treasury that they're really on board with much of this. I mean, the Treasury is going through a difficult time because of the political maelstrom around the Chancellor and whether she is still Chancellor in the next week, fortnight, month, minute. I mean, keep your eyes on the tab. And I think all of that's not helpful, because when you are in a government which is inevitably, as any government is, focusing on the short term. If you're focusing on the sort of micro short term, like do we get to the end of the week? As we saw with the last government, in fairness, they degenerated to that kind of get through to the weekend and then we'll heave a sigh of relief. That it throws away all of the idea of long distance planning. And it would be nice to think that there is a sort of gentle push, or quite a firm push actually, to say to the Treasury, no, look, this is really important. We are not committing enough. We need to be committing more money, but longer term as well. And I mean, you will know at least as well, if not better than I, that the MOD is currently looking at maybe cutting some projects in the next couple of years, because it's got a small increase coming in 2027 in funding. But you've got disasters like Ajax, which could be binned and has already cost us £5 billion. You've got the problems with the F-35 fleet. You've got the problems with Boxer. You've got submarine problems. We have either one or two of the 5 astute boats currently serviceable. We don't know how many. So there are massive, massive budgetary pressures. And these aren't going to go away unless we firstly get a grip of procurement, but also spend significantly more money. And that seems to be almost kind of agreed, but it's the implications of that which then seem to disappear like sort of fog in the morning.
So briefly in a sentence, because we're coming near the end of our time, from your perspective, do you think we're any closer to peace or further along the path to wider European or global conflict?
We're no closer to peace, and it would be my Christmas wish that we're no closer to global conflict.
Well, on that positive note, I'll take that as positive. It's a pity we're no closer to peace. Eliot Wilson, it has been a real pleasure talking to you today on Times Radio Frontline.
Thanks very much for that.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.